And I want to introduce a very special person whose life has been dedicated to advancing civil rights, public service, and education here in South Carolina and beyond. Mr. Jim Felder. He grew up in Sumter, South Carolina, which is where my family comes from. He has lived and worked in Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, Chicago, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. Following the completion of his undergraduate studies at Clark College in Atlanta, Georgia, he spent 2 years in the United States Army serving with the Honor Guard Ceremonial Unit in the nation's capital. He has a book about one of the very important roles that he played. After his tour of duty with the Army, he matriculated at Howard University School of Law, completing his studies in June 1967, and then returned to South Carolina, thankfully. Felder is a former member of the South Carolina House of Representatives from 70 to 72, and one of the first 3 blacks who served in the General Assembly here post-Reconstruction. He's the author of 3 books: I Buried John F. Kennedy, Civil Rights in South Carolina, The Making of an AME Bishop, and his latest book is The Life and Times of Lund C. Richardson. Jim Felder resides in Columbia, South Carolina, where he continues to write and remains active in the community. He has 2 children, Jimmy and Adrian, a son-in-law, Lancelot, and 2 grandchildren. Beautiful. He's smiling big. I don't know how that feels, but I can imagine how that feels. Lancelot II and Sean. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jim Felder.
Thank you, Alicia, and good afternoon. First, I want to acknowledge an individual who's in the audience that I've known since she was a little girl, State Representative Chandra Dillard. Chandra, stand. Chandra represents one of the House districts here in Greenville and has been serving for a long time. I knew her father, and many of you might have known him also. His name was Moses Dillard. He had a band here in Greenville called the Textile, what was the rest of it? The Textile Display, yeah, the Textile Display. One of his band members was a fellow named Peebo Bryson, played with that group. So, good to see you, Chandra. Now, on your table, you'll find a brochure on the museum, the South Carolina Civil Rights Museum. We were the only state that did not have a civil rights museum until several years ago, when Cecil Williams of Orangeburg and his family started in motion. Now we have a full-fledged civil rights museum in Orangeburg. Our grand opening will be in the first of the year. It's open already where it is in a location in a residential area. But we have a new building that's been completed, 10,000 square feet. It's in Orangeburg, right across the street from South Carolina State University and Claflin University. So on your way to Charleston, stop off at Orangeburg and check out the Civil Rights Museum. Some of you old-timers might have remembered a guy named Paul Harvey who used to do the news. Let me see the hands in here who remember. Oh, wow, okay. Paul Harvey would come on twice a day. He broadcast on the Mutual Radio Network. He'd come on at noontime and he'd give you part of the news. And then he'd come back at 4 o'clock and he would say, and now for the rest of the story. Well, the rest of the story on Clemente Pinckney is coming to you now. I knew Clemente before he married Jennifer. He was my student at Allen University. Good student. in business. I chaired the Department of Business and Economics at Allen, and I served on the board. He would stay after class to talk politics. And I said, "You're so interested in politics, why don't you go over to the State House? Let's see if we can get you a page slot over there." I called O.K. Patterson. Any of you all heard of that fella? He died last year at 92 years old. He was a colorful senator. And I called Juanita White, who was the House member from Jasper County. I said, "Listen, I've got a student over here. He's interested in politics. Find him a page slot." And they did. He served, he graduated from Allen, went back home, ran for the legislature, for the House, and won at 23 years old. 4 years later, ran for the state Senate and won. Became a pastor in AME Church, and the bishop promoted him real quick up to presiding elder. You know, the presiding elders are the middlemen in the church. They look over the pastors, and then they report to the bishop, and they tell the bishop who to change, and so on, da. He called me one day, and he said, "Professor Felder, I don't like this presiding elder stuff." He said, "It's too far away from the people. Call Bishop for me and see if he can reassign me." I said, "Why don't you call him?" He said, "No, I can't call the bishop and tell him to reassign me." Bishop Williams was in the territory at the time, and he moved him from presiding elder and sent him to Charleston to Mother Emanuel. And so now you've got the rest of the story, okay? The topic I understand today is, where do we go from here? First, let's talk about how we got here. 1939 was a great year. Why? The state NAACP was founded in South Carolina. Two men, one from Sumter, you're going to hear him talk a lot about Sumter, hometown, and one from Cheraw. The man from Sumter was S.J. McDonald Sr. He was a railway mail clerk. The man from Cheraw was a little fella named Levi G. Bird. He was a plumber. The people in Cheraw and Chesterfield County didn't like his activities, his NAACP activities, but they tolerated him. Why? He was the only plumber in town. McDonald got away with it because he worked on the train, he worked for the post office, worked in the mail. Those two got together, organized the NAACP in the basement of the library at Benedict College in 1939. The second thing that happened in 1939 was that a fellow named Harold Boulware from Irmo, South Carolina, he would graduate from Howard University Law School, came home and became the general counsel for the state NAACP. And the third thing, important thing that happened in 1939, I was born. So I thought we'd go back a little bit before we go down the road. South Carolina started the civil rights struggle with a lawsuit in Charleston. There were 7 lawsuits between 1939 and 1949 in South Carolina. The first one was about equal teacher pay. Black teachers were making a third less than white teachers. And we didn't think that was fair. A little lady named Modjeska Simpkins, who we refer to as the mother of civil rights in South Carolina, was in the bank one day. And she looked over her shoulder, and the white teacher's check was a third more than hers. So she goes back to the NAACP and said, "We need to do something about this." So we filed a lawsuit called Duvall versus the Charleston School Board. Harold Boulware called in Thurgood Marshall to help him out. He was a young lawyer. Thurgood had been his mentor and teacher at Howard Law School. So the day of the trial, walked into the courtroom. Thurgood Marshall didn't know what to expect, but the judge, white federal judge named J. Wadis Waring, he'd done a couple of things. First, he desegregated his courtroom. Because back in those days, blacks either sat upstairs or either they sat on one side, whites sat on the other side. Well, Waring had hired a black bailiff and had desegregated his courtroom. So Thurgood Marshall said, well, this is not so bad. When you go to court, the plaintiff put its case on first, right? And then the defense put their case on. Well, that day, Judge Waring, instead of asking the plaintiffs to get up, he turned to the defense table. And he said, when was the lawsuit on equal teacher pay heard in Virginia? The lawyers for the school district said, well, they started looking, they're thumbing through their papers. Marshall raised his hand. He said, I didn't ask you, Mr. Marshall. They finally found it. And he said, when was the lawsuit in Maryland heard on equal teacher pay? Again, they're stumbling to find it. Again, Marshall, stand up this time. He said, sit down, Mr. Marshall. Well, the courtroom is buzzing now. One old lady way in the back of the courtroom said, Lord, they won't even let her lawyer talk. Then they found the second case. Judge Waring turned to Thurgood Marshall. He said, Mr. Marshall, I was not trying to be rude to you, but you see, I knew you knew the answer because you handled both of those cases. He said, how long you want to give the school board of Charleston County time to equalize teacher pay? Marshall stood there with his mouth wide open, didn't know what to say. Finally, the judge said, well, 2 weeks, have on my desk a proposed order bringing black teachers up to white teachers. And he said, well, I'm not going to waste any more of the court's time. Banged his gavel, court dismissed. There was pandemonium in the courtroom. Marshall said, well, I'll be damned. 15 minutes, and I won a case without saying anything. That was the first case. The other cases that followed began with the law school. University of South Carolina would not allow blacks in. John Wright, an old World War II veteran, Geechee boy from Charleston, applied. They wouldn't let him in. So he sued. Again, Thurgood Marshall comes to town, teams up with Harold Boulware, filed a lawsuit. Lawsuit was filed in Columbia. The judge who should have handled the lawsuit was George Bell Timmerman Sr. But Timmerman was on the board of trustees of the University of South Carolina, so he had to recuse himself. So he brought Waring up from Charleston to hear the case. Waring listened to both sides. He said, all right, here's what I'm gonna do. You got 3 options. Talking to the lawyers for University of South Carolina, you got 3 options. Either you let him in the University of South Carolina. If you don't do that, you build him a law school at South Carolina State in Orangeburg. If you don't do 1 or 2, I'm gonna close the law school at the University of South Carolina. Now that's tough talk. It's tough talk in 1946 from a white judge. That was August 1947. September 1947, 2 months later, there was a law school up and running at South Carolina State College. It wasn't much of a law school to begin with. Matter of fact, the law school sat in a corner of the library for 2 years until they could build a building for the law school. That little law school at South Carolina State College graduated 51 students, 50 men and 1 female. Of that 50 men, they became some legal giants in South Carolina. Matthew J. Perry, of whom the federal court built name for in Columbia. Ernest A. Finney from Sumter became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. William Smith, here in Greenville, became a family court judge. Oh, I hear his voices back there. Jasper Curitan went on the court. And so, 1966, 19 years later, they closed the law school at South Carolina State because by now, the University of South Carolina were allowing blacks to attend. All right. The next cases were on the voting. White Democratic primary. Blacks couldn't vote in it, but it was the only game in town. So a fellow from Columbia named George Elmore, who by 1947 was a wealthy man. He owned 2 liquor stores in Columbia. He owned a photograph studio in Columbia. He owned a studio. He also owned a 5 and dime store on Jervis Street, right across from the Masonic Temple. But when he filed that lawsuit, something happened. They stopped delivering stuff to his stores. They called in his loans. His wife had a nervous breakdown, had to stay in institutions the rest of her life, and he died living in his truck in 1959. That was George Elmore. But we won the case. The Democratic Party had to open up. And so today people say, why you stay with the Democratic Party? Well, if you have to fight to get into something, you don't leave it. You try to make it better. Again, that was a Waring case. This guy, Judge Waring, he was super. And Charleston, because he was ruling in our favor in all of those cases, and the last case was the Briggs versus Elliott case, which led to Brown versus the Board of Education. You all heard about Brown versus the Board of Education. Did you know where it started? Clarendon County, Somerton. That's where it started, 1947. Reverend J. Delane, the AME preacher in the area, went to the superintendent and said, we need a bus. Children were walking 9 miles one way to school. Could you give us a bus? Superintendent, who was a Presbyterian minister, nope, got no money in the budget for black children's school buses. Well, they pooled their money, bought an old secondhand bus. It broke down a lot. Goes back to the superintendent, said, well, now we got a bus. Would you give us some gasoline? Nope, no money in the budget for gasoline. So they filed a lawsuit, Briggs versus Elliott. Many people suffered. They fired Mr. Briggs, who was a Navy veteran. He worked at a local service station, but when he signed the petition, they stopped delivering gas to the station, and the station owner fired him. Reverend J. Delane, who's the master of all of this, had to leave Somerton. They burned down his house. The fire department came and just watched it burn because he was 100 feet out of the city limits. So Reverend Delane moved to Lake City. The bishop sent him to Lake City to get him out of harm's way. Once the crowd over there, the Klan in Lake City, found out who he was, they'd ride by his house at night, shooting up in the air, throwing lemons and eggs at the house. So one night he shot back, and he hit 2 of them. And he had to leave South Carolina in a hurry, never to return. Went to New York, spent the rest of his days up there. Judge Waring, who had to leave Charleston, went to New York. The 2 of them got together and built a AME church in Buffalo, New York. And guess what the name of it is? Delane Waring AME Church in Buffalo, New York. Okay. That was the Briggs case. Now, Judge Waring, when you sue somebody based on a constitutional principle in federal court, you have to have 3 judges. So Waring was one of the judges. George Bell Timmerman Sr. was one of the judges. He was a racist from Batesburg. And the other judge was Weich out of Greenville here. The 3 of them heard the case. They ruled 2-1 that segregation was okay. So it was appealed to the US Supreme Court. It got there first. This Brown case that we make so much noise about didn't come in till later. It came out of Kansas. The problem with Brown was the high schools were integrated in Kansas, but the elementary schools were not. And black kids had to pass 3 white elementary schools to get to the black school. And they had to cross 12 railroad tracks. Some of them got injured. You know how kids are, they run under the track and all of that. So politics were involved. why it wasn't captured Briggs versus Elliott versus Brown versus Elliott. Your governor here in South Carolina, Jimmy Burns, was governor at the time. He'd served on the Supreme Court. Roosevelt had appointed him to the Supreme Court. He retired to come back home to South Carolina to run for governor. He didn't want South Carolina case to be on top. So he lobbied at the Supreme Court. Earl Warren wanted a unanimous decision. And so they said, all right, we'll put Brown on top and Briggs below it. Normally, when you have multiple plaintiffs in a case, they do it alphabetically, right? And I think Briggs come before Brown, right? Okay, it did last time I checked. So it should have been Briggs versus Elliott as opposed to Brown versus the Board of Topeka, Kansas. Well, Judge Waring, after that decision, he went to New York and stayed. Federal judge, he served for life. They tried to impeach him, but they couldn't do that. So 1968, Judge Waring dies in New York. They bring the body back to Charleston for burial. His nephew, who was the editor of the Post and Courier newspaper in Charleston, would not come to his uncle's funeral. 200 of us, organized by Reverend Ida Quincy Newman, who headed the NAACP at the time, we had a memorial service for him at St. Matthew's Baptist Church, and then we motorcaded up to Magnolia Cemetery. If you're familiar with Charleston, that's up Meeting Street. 200 of us and 12 white folks showed up for Judge Waring's funeral. The courthouse in Charleston is now named for him because Fritz Hollins, Ernest Hollins, it was named for him, said, no, Waring did more for South Carolina, take my name off. And you don't have a politician taking their name off anything. But that was one good thing that Fritz Hollins did. The other thing Hollins did is to support Robert Kennedy for president, John Kennedy for president. At President Kennedy's funeral, which I'll share with you in a minute, Hollins came to St. Matthew's Cathedral to get in. They wouldn't let Hollins in. Church was small, it wasn't as large as this room. But they let in Ida Quincy Newman, who was the president of the NAACP in South Carolina at the time. Why? Newman was dressed in full formal attire, cutaway coat, striped pants, stingy brim hat. They thought Newman was an Africa ambassador, and they let him in and wouldn't let Hollins in. Well, Hollins and I, we laugh about this for years. Well, anyway, that's what happened with Waring, and that's what happened to all those cases in South Carolina. Now, fast forward. 1960 comes. No, I got to tell you one more. Sarah Mae Fleming versus South Carolina Electric and Gas. Y'all used to have SC&G up here at one time, didn't you? Had the buses too, right? The utility company used to also own the bus services in Greenville, Columbia, and Charleston. Sarah Mae Fleming, 18-year-old domestic worker, got on the bus one morning, no seats were available, so she sat in the white section. The bus driver yanked her off the bus, punched her in the stomach, and said, don't get back on this bus anymore. That was 1954. She sued and won the lawsuit. So when the Rosa Parks case got to the Supreme Court out of Montgomery, Alabama, a year and a half later, all the Supreme Court did was say, well, Montgomery, Alabama, you have to desegregate your buses because we've settled this in South Carolina with Sarah Mae Fleming. Sarah Mae Fleming, 18-year-old domestic, she just kind of faded away. On the other hand, Rosa Parks, 40-year-old seamstress, secretary of the Montgomery, Alabama NAACP, the spotlight focused on her. So she got all the credit for desegregating the buses in this country, but it came out of Columbia, South Carolina, Sarah Fleming versus SC&G. Fast forward, 1960. Dr. King was moved back from Montgomery to Atlanta. I'm a student at Clark College in Atlanta, president of the student body, quarterback, had beaten Jesse Jackson out for the job. Jesse was supposed to come, and when he came down there and found out that I was quarterback, he left and went up to A&T. But we've been friends and frat brothers all these years, and I worked for him in Chicago. Well, anyway, that was my entry into the civil rights struggle in Atlanta, marching with King. We did our first march on March 15th, 1960 in Atlanta. 2 lines of us went downtown from the Atlanta University Center. You know, you got 6 HBCUs in Atlanta: Clark, Morehouse, Spelman, Morris, Brown, ITC, and so forth. Some 2,000 of us. Dr. King led one line, Julian Bond and I led the other line. Dr. King and his group got locked up. We went to the State House. When they saw us coming, they locked the doors. So we marched around the State House like you march around Jericho, hoping the walls would come down, and went back to campus. But that was my beginning with the civil rights movement. Now, we've marched, we've demonstrated, and then we end up in Washington, D.C. in 1963. By now, I'm in the Army. The March on Washington was planned. 1963 was the watermark of the civil rights struggle. It all started in January here in South Carolina. Harvey Gantt, who remember that name? Harvey Gantt was admitted to Clemson, January 1963. Went on, graduated, went to Charlotte, became the mayor in Charlotte, ran for Congress against Jesse Helms and all of that. That was January. February 1963, the Kennedys, Jackie and John, sent out 1,000 invitations to black folk, artists, athletes, singers, Lena Horne, you name it, to come to the White House for a party because the civil rights community was giving Kennedy hell. He hadn't named any blacks in his things. So they thought they'd have this big party. So they did. D.C. was a segregated city in 1963. Blacks couldn't live in the hotels. But when the president invites you, you come. So some folks slept in their cars, slept with family members, but 2 people turned down the invitation. One was Martin Luther King, Jr. He wrote the president a nice little note, said, "Mr. President, I can't come to your party. I'm planning a march on Birmingham." A. Philip Randolph, the old man who founded the sleeping car porters, the union for black folk who worked on the railroad, had a big booming voice, said, "Mr. President, I cannot come to your party. I'm planning a march on Washington." That was February. March, King is in Birmingham, leading marches and demonstrations, still planning. April, King writes his letter from the Birmingham jail. You all familiar with that? Those of you who are not, he wrote that letter because 8 white clergy got on him. Said, "Why are you here? We don't need you here. You're making trouble." And he wrote that letter to them on the back of some newspapers and a pencil that one of the trustees at the jail gave him. It was a powerful letter. You need to read it sometime. It's a powerful piece. That was April. May, he's got Birmingham turning it upside down. The children's campaign. You've got elementary children out in the streets. And Bull Connor, the old commissioner, got fire trucks and hoses knocking down people in the street, and you all saw some of those pictures. Dogs biting people. That's what got Kennedy's attention. June, he watches this on television. He makes a great speech on June 12th, 11 o'clock news. Proposed some legislation to Congress. At midnight, Medgar Evers is gunned down in his front yard in Jackson, Mississippi, coming home from an NAACP meeting. Also in June, old George Wallace stood in the door of the University of Alabama and said, "Segregation today segregation tomorrow, segregation ever, and then stepped aside because Bobby Kennedy had nationalized the Alabama Guard and the students were admitted to the University of Alabama. That was June. July, back home, South Carolina, they had closed all of the parks. Judge Robert Martin signed an executive order, signed an order desegregating the parks in South Carolina. That was July. August, the March on Washington. 250,000 people comes into town. No one was arrested. They left quietly. Just before Dr. King got up to do his I Have a Dream speech, Roy Wilkins, who headed the NAACP at that time, went up to him and he said, "The old man just died." Who was the old man? W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the NAACP, had died in Ghana. He left this country in the late 50s because they accused him of being a communist, and he went abroad. He went to Africa, and that's where he stayed, and that's where he's buried. That was August 1963. September 1963, the University of South Carolina finally came around and admitted 3 black students, James Solomon, John Anderson, and the Monteith lady. But also in September, there was a bombing in Birmingham. And the young, if you all saw that special or not, I don't know if you recently, called Birmingham Bombingham, because they used to blow up so many people's houses in Birmingham. The 16th Baptist Church, a bomb was thrown in by a Klansman. 4 little girls died in Sunday school. That was September. October, President Herbert Hoover got sick up in New York. I'm in the Army now, right? They weren't sure whether he was going to live or die. I'm with the Army honorary unit, honor guard unit at Fort Myer, Virginia, and my job was burying the dead in the cemetery. By the way, I handled Medgar funeral also, and afterwards escorted the wife and family to the White House for a reception. Well, President Hoover got better and went home. That was October. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy is at Arlington National Cemetery. It's Veterans Day, laying a wreath. The Custis Lee Mansion overlooks Arlington Cemetery. From it, you can see the White House and the Capitol. He stood in front of that place and said, "I could stay here forever." 2 weeks later, he was assassinated. And we buried him in that spot. Now, the powers that be back in Massachusetts wanted to bury him home, back in Massachusetts. But Miss Kennedy remembered what he said that day. And she said, "No, we're going to bury him in Washington." I handled the Kennedy's casket. For 4 days, it was never out of my sight. I was on leave when he was assassinated. I'm trying to stay within time here. I was on leave that Friday afternoon that he was assassinated in Dallas, because I hadn't planned to make the military my career. So I was out job hunting, coming out of the Department of Agriculture in Washington from a job interview. Walked outside, there's these ladies gathered around this taxi crying. Nosy me. What's going on? The old cab driver, very cold, very stoic. "Well, they just shot the president." I said, "What do you mean they shot the president? The president's in Dallas today. If you're in the military, you always know where the president is." "Yeah, that's where they got him, in Dallas." I was married, lived off post, got my Volkswagen, rode around D.C. Finally, Walter Cronkite came on and said, "The president is dead." Went home, went upstairs, telephone was ringing. It was the first sergeant. He said, "Sergeant Felder, you heard what happened to the president?" I said, "Yes, sir. Your leave has been canceled. You need to get out to Andrews Air Force Base, get your team out there. We got to go to Dallas and pick up the president's body." That's how it started for me. By the time we could get all our act together, Lyndon Johnson wanted to get out of Dallas. The president had been killed. Governor Conley, who was in the jump seat in front of the president, had been shot. Johnson didn't know what was going on, so he wanted to get to Love Field, where Air Force One was, to get out of Dallas. Took the oath of office on Air Force One. Y'all might remember that picture, Miss Kennedy standing beside him in her blood-stained dress. So he was on his way back, so we waited at the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. Air Force One touched down, we took the casket off. We were going to take it to Walter Reed Army Hospital for autopsy and embalming and all of that. But some old Navy admiral said, no, can't take him to Walter Reed. He was Navy, take him to Bethesda. Bethesda's a naval hospital in Washington. So we took the body up to Bethesda Hospital. I witnessed my first autopsy, which lasts for 6 hours. The president was hit twice. There were 3 shots fired. The first shot hit the dirt by the limousine. The second shot hit the president in the back, nicked his tie, came out front, and hit Governor Conley. But it was the third shot that was the fatal one. It hit him in the back of the head. I hope you all not getting whatever on this. I don't want to be groovy on it. And came out the top, bringing brain tissue and hair also. People say Jackie was trying to get out of the limousine when she was crawling on the back of it. She was trying to retrieve his hair, and she did. Well, anyway, that was the president's story. For 4 days after that, we took him all the way around D.C. to the White House, and that was an interesting place. Heads of state started coming in from all over the country. What was really interesting, because I'm standing there, I can't leave the body in charge of it. Here comes George Wallace of Alabama and Chief Justice Earl Warren, walking almost hand in hand. What a sight that was. Then here comes Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, 5'4", full military dress, and walking beside him, Charles de Gaulle of France, 6'4". So you had Mutt and Jeff. And they stayed together for the next 4 days. You saw one, you saw the other. And it went on and on and on. Well, anyway, fast forward. After lying in state in the White House, we took it to the Rotunda. It stayed there all night. Then we took it to St. Matthew's Cathedral for burial. And that, I told you the story about Fritz Holland, how he couldn't get into the funeral. After that, it was all over. Flag was folded. I checked it for red, and I passed it to Miss Kennedy, and my job was over. My leave was reinstated, came back home to Sumter, South Carolina for Thanksgiving. Morris College used to have a football team at that time. They made me Grand Marshal, and here I'm riding through the city, waving and so forth. Get back to Washington, I get another phone call. This time is from the wife of my commander, Mike Groves, 28 years old. She said, Jim, I know you're getting ready to get out the Army. They tell me you don't even have a uniform anymore. I said, that's right. She said, but I know Mike would want you to do his funeral. So I had to borrow a funeral. I did Mike Groves' funeral. And then I went in to see the first sergeant. I said, Sergeant Sharp, in the last 10 days, I have buried the commander-in-chief, and I have buried my company commander. I am not going back into Arlington Cemetery anymore. He laughed. But remember, you're still in the Army. I said, yes, I do. He said, well, you're going to have to come out here every day and sit in the barrack until you are discharged. And I did that. Didn't go back to Arlington for 20 years. And then I went back because Joe Louis died. Y'all remember the old boxer? They call him the Brown Bomber. Joe was a World War II veteran. But by the time he died, they had changed the rules at Arlington. And today, the only way you can be buried in Arlington Cemetery is you get killed on active duty or spend 20 years in the military or get an executive order. And in my mind, that was one of the best things Ronald Reagan did when he issued an executive order to allow Joe Louis to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. I get a call from Jesse Jackson, homeboy, as he always called me. The family, Joe Louis' family, want me to do the eulogy at Arlington. I've never been to Arlington. Can you meet me there? I said, I'll see you in Arlington, Jesse. So I went up to D.C. We did Joe Louis' funeral. And it was after that I wrote the book, I Buried John Kennedy, because everybody would ask the question, how did you, a little black boy from Sumter, South Carolina, get selected to head Kennedy's team? And you veterans know how that happened. The military has a seniority system, and whoever's the senior person in any group, detail, picking up paper, what have you, you could have 50 privates picking up paper and one PFC who's in charge. The PFC. And that's what happened with Kennedy. I just happened to be the senior first person for funerals. I did 1,100 funerals in Arlington Cemetery, and that was enough for me. Now finally, I told you where we have come from a legal standpoint, and from marching and demonstrating. So where do we go from here? I am suggesting that we do this. We've got to hit the streets again. Marching and demonstrating brought us thus far. Everything we enjoyed today resulted from a march or a demonstration. Whether or not was the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and what happened? We got the 65 Voting Rights Act. Whether or not it was the March on Washington, which we got the 64 Civil Rights Bill. Last Saturday, what was it, 7 million people marching in this country, and they got attention. You got to express yourself, and you've got to vote. I heard Susan up here talking about what the League is doing, and I do a lot of work with the League. But we are not turning out in the right numbers. Here in South Carolina, black and white, we are only turning out 50%, 54% on election day. The highest we've had here among black folk in South Carolina was when Obama ran. We went up to 76% turnout. And since that time, it's been downhill ever since. So you get what you get. So my charge to you today, and the young folk, we have got to march, we've got to demonstrate, we've got to vote, we've got to register others to vote. And it's so simple today. In my day, we had paper ballots. Took all night to count them. To register to vote, the registration office was only open 2 days a week, and you were at the mercy of the registrar. If he or she didn't like the way you interpreted the Constitution, they'd deny you to go and come back 30 days more. So we have been through that. Now there's some stuff going on now to again suppress the vote, gerrymandering and changing the districts. Why? Power, to retain power. So we can do better than that. Vernon Johns, and then I'm through. Reverend Vernon Johns was the pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He used to preach social gospel even back then, but his church was one of them silk stocking churches, you know? They didn't make no loud noise. They didn't say, amen, none of that. His congregation were the professors at Alabama State University and the professional people in Montgomery. That was his congregation. But he was beating up on them all the time. They got tired of hearing him preach that stuff. So they ran him off. The other reason they ran him off is because he was a farmer. And he would grow his fruit, and on Saturday, he'd sit on the steps of the church downtown Montgomery selling his fruit. And they didn't like their pastor doing that. So they ran him off. And who did they get? Martin Luther King Jr. And the rest is history. Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.